someone's on. Good to see. I'm starting the stream a little early so people can jump on before we actually get started with the topic. I'm just going to post that. Alrighty. There we go. All right, how's everyone doing? I'll want to let you know that Zoom is also an option. I think I have the Zoom link in the event on the Holy Family Cathedral page. So feel free to join on that, especially if you want to ask questions and stuff, because the lag is a lot more minimized in Zoom. Facebook has a pretty significant lag between myself and you guys, so I don't always get to see your questions right away. Now let's take care of a couple other things and then get started. Interesting how that works. Alright, put people on. We still have some time. It's good. Alright, again, if anyone's on, please feel free to jump on Zoom, but of course you don't have to. Whatever you feel comfortable with. Just, I like it. I like when you guys are on Zoom. It's nice for me. All right, share now. Share, cool. Let's see, I do want to keep an eye on how many people are on. Awesome. How much time do we have right now? We've got some more time, 6 minutes. Happy Sunday, happy 4th Sunday of Easter, 3rd Sunday after Easter, I think is what the old calendar calls it. Same thing. Hope everyone's having a good time. And excited for what I hope is going to be a pretty juicy topic. I made sure this time, I've gotten this wrong so many times, made sure to actually have like the Facebook comments visible the entire time. I was forgetting to scroll through them last time, which is entirely my bad. But Zoom is still kind of my main screen, just in case people want to jump on. It's nice. It's nice seeing faces. You know what I mean? It's something I appreciate. Alrighty. 5 more minutes. Although what I've heard is convenient for some people with this kind of online talk is that you guys can just get work done while I ramble. I know some people have done laundry or cooked food at the same time. Yep, there we go. Makes sense. I appreciate it, Ginger. To be fair, these are my these are my pajamas I'm wearing right now. There's no shame. Good morning, Lynn. Thank you guys for joining me. Happy Good Shepherd Sunday. Happy Good Shepherd Sunday. It's kind of a good, joyful occasion. Try to pick appropriate, or at least one appropriate, shepherdy hymn for Mass this morning. I hope everyone's doing okay now that we've gone through this entire lockdown thing for a number of weeks now. Are we on 5 or 6? Can't actually keep track. It's been a while. But yeah, I hope everyone's hanging in there. I think we're doing okay here. I would say we actually have a lot of ways pretty good for a bunch of priests and a religious brother in that, we had this this new rectory that was built just in time for something like this, and an actual community of like 5 guys, so pretty good size of people you get to still see and hang out with, and not worry too much about social distancing since we all share germs all the time anyway, being one household. But we sure do miss you guys, and as much fun as figuring out all this technology stuff is, it's really not quite the same. But of course, there's the pajama argument, so I can't really argue against Ginger for that one. Okay, we'll get started pretty soon. I hope you guys have like questions or things you do want to talk about, because I think this kind of topic it's more topical, if you will, compared to the stuff I usually talk about. I'm usually a little bit more interested personally in things like dogmatic theology or spiritual theology, so moral theology, but within the realm of the supernatural, given the talk I gave a while back, and the role of grace and divine action within the soul. So like, properly speaking, moral theology, insofar as like casuistry or analysis of what is or is not sinful, super important stuff, but I don't usually. Yes. Is there a mass in Rosary happening at 12? That's a good question. I am on Zoom. The link is in the event. Sorry, there's still a lot of experimenting happening. There's an event that was posted for this. Maybe I can just find the link. Let me just grab it. Let me just grab it for you guys to post it. And if any trolls show up, I'll just get rid of them, which will hopefully be relatively painless. Copy link address. I can't tell you for sure. My sense was, oh my gosh, that's not what I want to do. There we go. What's unpinned? Okay. Yeah, my sense was that that wasn't the case today, because we already have 3 masses happening today, and I for sure won't be able to make it unless I really finish on time for a 12 o'clock thing. You'll have to double check. I don't remember exactly what the post said. I think it was Father Steve clarified Monday through Saturday. That's why we did the St. Joseph prayer at the 9:30 Mass, because that was in a sense kind of counting for the novena, if that works. All right. I think it's almost time to get started. Yes, it is. I'm pretty lonely on Zoom. Don't see anyone here. Oh, there we go. We have someone. Hi, guys. Good to see you. Oh, very pleasant. All right, cool. Let's get started then. So today the topic is on conscience. Conscience is actually a really interesting topic because it's one that, first of all, has a pretty interesting history within the thought of the church and different theologians, especially more recently. But also it's one that gets kind of abused. You see these quotes getting thrown around by completely different groups for completely different intentions or purposes. And there's a lot of tension insofar as the church wants to talk about the freedom and the responsibility of the individual person in their moral life, and yet there's also the importance of recognizing the role of authority. Hence the title of the talk is not just conscience, but conscience, authority, and truth. I want to see if we can map all those things together. Okay? So I'm going to start just off the top with some suggested reading, because more importantly than you guys listening to me is you guys hearing and reading from people who are smarter than me. So there's 2 links I posted in the comments at least for the Facebook Live, but let me see if I can drop it in Zoom too. So So if I talk about a bunch of stuff and you're like, Brother Andrew Thomas, this makes no sense. That was completely not helpful at all. Then you can always refer to those readings because I think those are really valuable, actually. The first one being a classic text now on conscience. Oh my gosh. Is that Grace? Oh, hello, Grace. You're alive. Good to see you. Anyway, sorry. So the first text is one from Cardinal Newman. Classic. It's the one that gets quoted and misquoted a lot, though. So it's important to know that one. And it sort of became the foundation of a more new and not really new, but a modern and developed way of looking at what conscience is. It was super influential in the references to conscience in the Second Vatican Council. Okay, that's the first one. The second one I have in there is a talk given by, at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, I think to a bunch of bishops. Now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He quotes from Newman a lot. He's a huge fan of Cardinal Newman. He was the one who beatified him, I believe. But he does do a lot of interesting, first of all, contemporary thought with respect to conscience, since Newman's a 19th century theologian. And also a lot of interesting original stuff, too. He brings in a lot of different things, like I think St. Basil the Great, he throws in a little bit of Plato. But it's very typical, like, Pope Benedict stuff of, like, super clear, super insightful, asks all the right questions. So I highly recommend that talk also. I'm going to reference St. Thomas Aquinas on this stuff. He has some interesting things to say for sure on conscience, but people don't usually look to him initially for this, mostly because it's harder to find what he wants to say about this. His things on conscience are kind of spread across like 3 or 4 different parts of the Summa that you don't know you're supposed to connect. And this is the beautiful and the annoying thing about reading St. Thomas Aquinas, is that his thought is so connected. It's the analogy that a lot of theologians actually use is like it's like a cathedral. Every part has its function for the sake of the whole, and it all comes together in this beautiful, grand edifice. But if you're looking for a topic, you are looking at like one piece, not realizing the role it plays in the whole. So when it comes to looking for St. Thomas's thought on conscience, you have to look for his thing initially on the intellectual powers of the human soul, on the goodness of the moral action with respect to an erring reason, and his understanding of natural law and eternal law. Completely separate parts. So we'll talk about that, but you guys don't have to read that. That's definitely extra credit for you, although I'll be very happy if you do. Good morning, Miriam. Thank you guys for joining. Cool. Let's work backwards with respect to the history of the thought of conscience. So I'm going to start with Gaudium et Spes, Second Vatican Council, authoritative text. What does it have to say about conscience? And some of you guys might know this paragraph. Deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. Its voice, ever calling him to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil, sounds in his heart at the right moment. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There, he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. Wow, very poetic, very pretty. Thank you, Second Vatican Council, for that. But also, I want to read that just to show, like, okay, here's the recent conciliar text that talks about conscience, and it's clearly gives it a high role, a very significant dignity. Conscience is the voice of God speaking within the soul, right, within the individual. It's not something to be dismissed or thrown away just because we have moral teachings, because we have authority, because we have a pope and bishops in the magisterium. Conscience has a real role to play in our moral lives. However, the problem often is still that people use conscience as something to be opposed to the authority of the church. Insofar as a person would say, like, oh, sure, this is what the church teaches, but this is what my conscience says, so I'm going to just ignore you now. This is kind of the language that was used, I think, in a lot of dissent towards Humanae Vitae, the encyclical of Paul VI. People are saying, sure, the Pope wrote this document, but, follow your conscience. There's a lot of problems in what's presupposed in that kind of language. So highly discourage that, but it's very subtle. So what's the problem here? Let's map this out. I'm doing my typical thing. I always like to start with errors, just to make sure we're not there. We'll find our place somewhere in the middle. So misinterpretation number one is thinking that conscience is something that is infallible and strictly, entirely subjective. It is subjective. It is a subjective authority in our moral life, right? In a sense, it sort of mediates for the eternal law by being the eternal law within us. That's another thing I'll talk about later. But to think of it as so objective that it has no reference to objectivity, to reality, right? Everyone has a conscience. You can't question a person's conscience. Everyone's conscience is therefore infallible with respect to their own morality and their own action. And so you just let everyone be. The problem is that different consciences seem often enough to disagree with each other. So does that mean that morality is something completely relative? Like, is there not really an objective good an objective standard that we should hold people to? Or is it simply about letting people do whatever just kind of feels right for them? And there are moral theories that kind of hold that. Clearly, I'm not a fan. So this is where you get very, very strictly individualistic forms of ethics. An example of that being like emotivism, which is a really extreme form. I don't know if you guys have heard of this one before, but it's basically the idea that when we talk about moral precepts, about moral norms, when we say this is a good thing to do, it's kind of a linguistic veil over actually saying, I like this, and I'm trying to persuade you to also like this, even though there's not really a real objective good this between the two people. It turns morality in a sense to politics, to simply rhetoric and persuasion. Not good. Not good at all. Strongly disagree. I hope that also sends chills down your spine, because that's not what we mean when we're talking about morality in the moral life. So with that notion of conscience, which is more just like whatever I feel like, there's not a sense of what's objectively good. Clearly not going to work, especially for us, but generally for human nature. The other approach actually is in some ways the same error, but just with a different choice. The other approach is one that's strictly authoritarian. And this is, I think, what people are reacting to when they give this more individualistic, relativistic notion of conscience, which is the idea that, sure, you have your conscience, your special inner little voice in your thoughts, but forget it. It doesn't matter. All that matters is obedience. All that matters is law. Is there a law? You will follow it. Exactly what it says to the letter. And there's no questioning behind that. So each one is right in some ways in that, yes, law matters. Yes, there is something to do with authority in our moral lives. And yet there is something real about this inner voice, about what we think about what's right. So the authoritarian error is one that sort of degrades the moral life into one, again, that only has to do with the will, right? Conscience and authority, conscience and law become one will against the other. And this person who has an authoritarian notion of morality, therefore just thinks we have to suppress our will to choose in a sort of forced humility the will of the superior. Again, obedience is a real part of morality, and especially in the case of one who's made a vow of obedience. But it's not the essence of what makes something good. It has a role. It's a help, and especially for the role of purifying one's selfishness. But a thing is not good simply because an authority has said so, right? This is a kind of voluntarism that, for example, even when looking at God, let's say, it is good simply because it is decreed to be good, as opposed to it's good because God himself in his nature is essential goodness, right? There's a subtle difference there, but it's super important in how we understand morality. I could throw under the bus the thinker that I'm talking about, but I've already accused him before, so I'm not going to do that. He's a 13th century, 14th century theologian. I'm really not a huge fan. But he was a big contributor to this notion of voluntarism, of allowing everything to just reside solely in the will. And I think that did actually a lot of damage to the church. But luckily, we still have St. Thomas Aquinas to help us with that. Anyway, so what's wrong here? The danger here is obviously is that there's no conviction then of an actual, still of a moral reality, that there's this thing that is good that we ought to pursue, simply because it is good in its nature. Nor does it think there's any intelligibility in the moral life, right? An ability for us to know the truth, again, hence the title. Who was that? Call him out. Says Grace, apparently, even though I saw Chris type it in. It's not super important, but I guess if you guys are super interested in medieval thought, there is a thinker whose name is William of Ockham. He's referenced a lot, for example, in, I saw a confused face, very good. William of Ockham, his name is familiar for Occam's razor, which is used a lot in like debates and logic and stuff. He was super influential for logic, really, really good with logic. The problem is he kind of treats everything as if it was purely logic, without really deep penetration in the nature of things. He didn't really think we could penetrate the nature of things. But that's a complicated philosophy topic that we don't need to go into. But you tricked me. I talked about it. Thanks, guys. And hello, Borges family. Now that I can actually see you guys all. Hope you guys are having fun. All right, where are we? Right, so the essential error here is thinking that these are just two independent, oppositional, is that really the right word I want to use? I'm going to use it anyway. Right, doing your own thing. It is a very secular way of thinking. Secularism, I think, often can degrade into a certain kind of relativism and strict individualism. It really depends. There's I don't know too much, but there's maybe two approaches within the secular sphere of morality. One that might be more libertarian, which is just leave me alone, I'm going to do what I want to do. Or there's one that's, in a sense, more ideological, more political in its thinking of truth. In a sense, truth is not a thing, but it becomes an instrument by which you persuade others. Truth is really about power. And that leads to the opposite of that more libertarian approach. But anyway, we don't need to go into that right now. That's not the topic of today. Good notion, though. Good observation. Right. So conscience and our own individual appreciation and judgment of what is good. Authority, law. If these two things are completely independent, and there's no common reference between the two, they're necessarily going to be seen as things that oppose, that are in conflict and competition. And you have to just choose between one or the other. So they need some kind of common referent, something that they're both about. And surprise, surprise, what is that but truth? Hence, again, the title, Conscience, Authority, and Truth. Really, it should be about truth. So I'm going to give what I hope to be the short answer now, and then maybe we can do a little bit more deep dive afterwards. But this way, anyone who just wanted to know what Brother Andrew Thomas was going to say can leave after that. And everyone who really wants the extra stuff can hang out. All right. So is conscience something to be followed? When we say follow your conscience, is that something that's just kind of annoying and trite, or is that really of value? The classical response is, of course you follow your conscience. It should be trivial to say follow your conscience, because to follow your conscience is do what you think is right, is try to be moral. And the church is never going to say don't try to be moral. That's pretty dumb, pretty silly. However, the mistake is in, again, divorcing this notion of conscience from reality, allowing conscience to become either like this mystical, magical, unquestionable thing within us, or simply what we feel. If conscience becomes a fancy word for self-will. Right, exactly. That was well timed, Tiffany. My will is what you said. And those notions of conscience are obviously problematic. There's actually a really fun, sassy quote from Pope Benedict. Let's see if I can find it for you. Here it is, from Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. It is strange that some theologians have difficulty accepting the precise and limited doctrine of papal infallibility, but see no problem in granting de facto infallibility to everyone who has a conscience, which is then namely just everyone. And it is a clear, strange conflict that you see. Thank you, or cricket. Fun fact: Jiminy Cricket. I think like there's actually specifically a Christian like euphemism going on there. Like his initials were intentionally JC for that reason, in a sense of like conscience being Christ within the soul. I need to fact check that, but it seems to make sense. Apparently, Cardinal Newman was the one who wrote Pinocchio. We'll get to him soon. I'm kidding, obviously, by the way. All right. So a notion that the conscience is not something that can be questioned, corrected, instructed, developed, right? If you don't think that's how conscience works, then there's a problem. Yes, you follow your conscience, but conscience is basically your judgment of what is right. Do what you think is right, but you need help figuring out what that is, as we all do. So yeah, conscience therefore has a relation then to reality, to truth, to human nature. And this is the part of conscience that can develop. We need to have a deeper understanding of reality, of ourselves, of the particular situation, and then we have to trust our judgment, right? This is where the church then kind of comes into play. The church is not simply an authority. She has laws, and she can't demand things of us simply in obedience. So there's observances that we have to do. That's because she's our mother in that sense, and she tells us, this is something I think you should do, and I'm asking you to do it. Fine. But her moral teaching is something different. Her moral teaching is teaching. It's not simply command, right? She's this time in the role of teacher rather than mother. And that's why it has a role in terms of our moral life and has a relationship to our conscience. Since conscience is about just acting morally, making right moral judgments, it's something that requires education, right? Same way you look at a child, you don't expect them to have a conscience that tells them everything they should do. They need to be taught this upset this other person, this hurts this other person. This is just not good for you. And I want you to do that which is good for you. So you instruct your child to know and have these things ingrained into one's conscience, right? So it becomes less of a puzzle and eventually becomes something more that feels more innate, but it still requires that input. It's the same with the role of the church in her morality. We need to be taught. We need to be taught how to think about morality. There's an analogy, I think, that Pope Benedict XVI makes, at the time Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, of conscience and moral thought basically being like language. Language in human persons is natural to the human being, right? You can't really think, I mean, you can in exceptional cases, but generally with a human person, they have language. They own their own language. They can communicate and express themselves, and they have this freedom with their language. And yet it requires education. It requires input. It requires the role of a parent to speak to them. And then this really magical thing happens of a child acquiring words and grammar and this ability to form concepts from basically nothing. Oh, sounds like there's a little bit of interference going on. I'm going to go ahead and do that myself. Hope you're okay with that, Susan. I'm muting you. Seems like it's kind of causing some noise for people. Okay. Does that make sense? So authority being an authority to teach, not simply an authority to command, even though that has its place too. but obviously different. The authority of the church with respect to the moral law is not simply deciding what is good or bad, but it's interpreting from reality, from her understanding of human nature, from revelation, from scripture, from the teachings of our Lord, what it is for a human person to do that which is good, right? And the special role that the church has with respect to this, what gives her a special authority, not only the fact that the authority was passed to her from Christ, not only that we trust her infallibility with respect to faith and morals and the Holy Spirit, but in a sense, a more practical way of looking at it is morality is something, yes, intelligible, this is something I was trying to say earlier, is not arbitrary. It's something we can learn about, reason about, and hopefully one day understand. But it's also something that's purposeful. Morality is not just about me, my will, here. It definitely is. Morality is a very particular thing. It's not like math. It's not like speculative reasoning, although there's some ethical thinkers who try to reduce it to something mathematical. My point more is that morality is about ends. It's about purposes. And so our conscience, then, is about making judgments about what is a fitting means to my end, to that for which I exist, that my purpose. And this is why the church has such an important role to play, just generally speaking, because she, as the one who interprets Revelation, knows about this very special end, the special destiny of the human person that's not obvious in nature, which is our sanctification, which is heaven, which is eternal beatitude, which is being raised to the dignity of sons, of friends, and if I can use romantic language, of beloved of God. That's not obvious from a person simply with a relation to nature, which is why it's important that the church clarifies how we understand nature through, in a sense, our understanding of grace, of the supernatural, of our great Christian dignity, and of the call of the whole world to share in that dignity as called to the faith. But then, in light of that end, also to understand what's happening in the particular moment, since every action we do has some role to play in our pursuit of that end. Was that technical? I don't know. Hopefully you guys can follow. All right, I saw a nod and a laugh, which either meant yes, it was way too technical, please move on further into Thomas, or we appreciate it. I'm going to go with both and keep moving. Right, so yes, everyone has a conscience. Yes, everyone should follow a conscience. But the conscience can be wrong. That places us in a kind of a weird situation, right? So we can fail morally in two different ways. And I think a lot of times people reduce it to one. So the first and obvious one is a failure of the will. And we all know this, right? Conscience speaks to the individual, and I'm using that in a more anthropomorphic, figurative way. And one does not obey one's own conscience. I'm sure we all know this in greater degrees and in lesser degrees of, you know this is the right thing to do, or you shouldn't do that, but I want to do the thing anyway, or vice versa. Has that happened to you guys? Maybe not. It certainly has happened to me. Basically every time I'm on YouTube much longer than I need to be, but also for things of possibly of graver matter. So failing to obey one's conscience is a failure of the will, but it involves other parts of the soul too. It involves, for example, our passions, our draw towards things kind of in a more sensible, not yet intellectual level that can deaden or mute the conscience or just have such a pull on the will. These are kind of classical moral failures that we talk about, right? This is what usually people think of with respect to sin. So voluntary acting contrary to what one knows to be good. Cool. That's a bad thing. Seems pretty clear. We all know it. We all experience it. Fine. But there's also an intellectual fail. Also weird. Intellectual failure was a word I was looking for. Yes, a hardcore total fail with respect to the intellect and the moral life. Which is when our judgment of what's right is, again, divorced from reality or divorced from revelation, which, of course, is not going to be in opposition with reality. So what we know to be right has a real role to play. Again, this places us in a pretty uncomfortable situation. So I'm going to skip straight to St. Thomas Aquinas and talk about what is a moral act with respect to an erring conscience, or erring conscience, however you want to pronounce it. I had a superior who didn't like err, so I have it drilled into me that I'm supposed to say now. Is one supposed to act contrary to conscience if the conscience is false, if the conscience is incorrect? It's a question. I'm actually asking a question. Please feel free to jump in. Comments, mic, anything. Because this is actually something that there was not always a consensus for within, among theologians of the church. For example, I think St. Thomas Aquinas' answer actually contradicted the answer of some pretty influential theologians before him. Such an edgy guy, right? So progressive, St. Thomas Aquinas. But I think it's also really insightful what he's saying. I think I see at least one person probably typing. No, but you wouldn't know that your conscience was in error, right? So St. Thomas Aquinas goes so far as to say, let me see if I can find it here. All right, quote number 2 or 3. From the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, question 19, article 5, in case you guys wanted to find it. We must therefore conclude that, absolutely speaking, every will at variance with reason, whether right or erring, is always evil. I just want to let that sink in. It's a pretty strong statement, right? One more time. Every will at variance with reason, whether right or erring. So a will that contradicts one's own moral judgment, whether or not that judgment is correct, is always evil. So if one does not act according to conscience, one sins. It is a sin to not follow your conscience, even if your conscience is wrong. Okay. However, does that mean that following one's conscience, if it is erring, is the correct and moral thing to do? This is what Peter Abelard said. He was a super edgy theologian, I think, of like the 11th century, but really influential in this classic thought. He had this notion that basically there was no sin in crucifying Christ among the Romans, for example, because they thought they were doing what was right, or among the Jews because they thought they were basically executing a person who committed blasphemy. So therefore, there was no sin in the act of the crucifixion. This Abelard's position. St. Thomas Aquinas is not cool with that. So here's what he says. It's a little bit more complicated, though. If then reason or conscience err with an error that is voluntary, either directly or through negligence, so that one errs about what one ought to know, then such an error of reason or conscience does not excuse the will that abides by that erring reason or conscience from being evil. But if the error arise from ignorance of some circumstance, and without any negligence, so that it cause the act to be involuntary, then that error of reason or conscience excuses the will that abides by that erring reason from being evil. Kind of a complicated way of saying it. So basically, it depends. In the obvious cases, sure, one can follow an erring judgment if there's really no way for anyone to expect you to know what the right thing to do is. And there's a classical example I'll talk about later. It's kind of a funny example, actually, that St. Thomas Aquinas gives. But in the case where one has the responsibility of knowing, which in any case of just not, he specifies particulars, so like a circumstantial thing. If you don't know that, you can't know everything about the circumstances. But besides that, if one follows an erring conscience, it's still sinful. But the sin really resides in not knowing. I see hands moving. Invincible ignorance is almost impossible in this day and age through internet. Thank you. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good point. Now, of course, we have to go into defining what invincible ignorance is. And it's true, we have a lot of information available to us. We can never say that we have no access to, for example, the church's teaching on certain things. The example St. Thomas Aquinas gives for invincible ignorance is not even of that kind anyway. So his apparently classic example is a man who is married, comes home to his wife, and let's say, for example, like she gives some clear indication that she would like him to satisfy marital debt, right? And him being a good, responsible, moral husband says, I am a husband, I've made vows, I have a duty to my wife, to whom it says I've given my body. And she's asked me this, and she's been very clear, so I'm going to do it and be a good husband and give her what she wants. He finds out the next day that that wasn't his wife at all. Somehow. I know, plot twist. Oh my gosh, this could be a Korean drama. I see people typing, so I'm going to wait for something to happen in the chat box first. Wait, who? Yes, he got laid, but a little late in the game. So, in that kind of situation, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas thinks of for like invincible ignorance. The guy was doing everything he thought was supposed to be right. He didn't know the situation perfectly. He didn't know like that. He had, sure, there's probably like some way, but you don't expect a person to be like thinking in this paranoid way, like, who is this person who's in my room constantly? If he has reason to believe this person is his wife and he acts in accordance with that, then that's that. Oh, sorry, Tiffany, you missed it. Basically, an example of St. Thomas Aquinas for invincible ignorance is a guy sleeps with his wife and doesn't realize it's not his wife. In that case, he is not responsible. Of course, we need to look more into the circumstances and the actual details of the story to find out, well, really, couldn't he have been responsible? But again, this is the example given in terms of ignorance of circumstances, right? Not ignorance of morality as a whole. So generally speaking, unless it's one of these like situations where like, how the heck was I supposed to know? The problem of erring conscience puts us in a really bad position, actually, in that one has to follow one's conscience, at least insofar as one can't act contrary to that. So there's some Franciscan theologians at the time who thought that you were not sinning if you act contrary to an erring conscience. So they're thinking almost purely in the objective level. What is the law, and does one follow the law? But St. Thomas Aquinas wasn't okay with that, because the role of the person's intellect, there's a subjective element to objective morality that was being ignored in that kind of analysis. So, again, it puts us in a pretty uncomfortable situation where if we have an erring conscience, if we make a poor judgment, and a judgment we have responsibility to make true. Oh, I see a raised hand. Yes, please speak.
Mom told us to ask a question. Her question was essentially like, with invincible ignorance, what happens if somebody who has like authority over you, like if I was 12 or 22 living in my parents' house, and my parents say something like an authority figure says something to me, but it's wrong.
You don't really need to go to mass on Sunday or something.
Do you know what I mean? Assuming that it's something that you aren't sure about, because obviously if you know it's wrong, you're not allowed to act on it. If your parents said to like kill someone, you wouldn't. Yeah, like if, but it's like, but if it was something that was a little bit more, if it was like your Catholic mother saying, like communion isn't necessary, we can just like, we can just like in normal conditions, like we can just like, read the Bible, be the fine, we don't really need to listen to the church, something like that, you know what I mean? And so, and they're an authority figure over you. Like if, again, I was 12.
Right. No, that's a really good question.
Invincible?
And it actually really ties in with lowering your hand, by the way. I'm trying to figure out how to use this app while listening to you. Lower hand, by the way, is kind of a strange image. Like the kid's raising the hand, you're like, okay, now. Anyway, sorry. Zoom jokes. Yeah, this actually ties in really closely to another analogy given about the role of the erring conscience. The other one being, in a sense, like a military example, for example. So let's say that there's the commander who says, we're doing this. This is what I need you to do. We're going to go to that place and attack, et cetera, blah, blah, at this time. And an officer who's subordinate to that commander tells his subordinates, not saying he's contradicting the superior, but simply says, this is what he said, and says something contrary to it, right? The soldiers have no responsibility, in a sense, for doing that thing which was incorrect, right? And this is more within the level of just talking about obedience. They didn't know they were not following the commander's orders. The responsibility then lies in the person between, who was not passing on that information correctly. Does that make sense? I'm seeing reactions, but I don't know what they are. Shoot.
Okay, she's just
go.
Hi, but so about in like situations though, like there's like I'll see like videos on YouTube, very credible source of like there was the Westboro Baptist Church and things like that, and there were members, and all their families were members of the church, but eventually they did, even like some members said, I think like they didn't even really like get reached out to by other people. It was just kind of one day they felt like this was really wrong to be like in this situation. I hear that like about like other situations where everyone in like authority of the person was telling them to think a certain way, but at some point they just like felt like, no, this is not right. And I would suppose that means that your conscience was telling you it's not right, so you have to follow it. But at the same time, like if the person did follow the rest of their authority figures because it is like their parents and the person they respect as like the pastor or somebody like that, then would that be invincible ignorance still?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to, in some ways, sorry to give a typical unhelpful Dominican answer, but I think it's going to have to depend on a lot. So the problem with the analogy I gave was it was simply about commands from a superior, right? So the person who's the lowest subordinate has no way of knowing what the superior, what the actual commander said, right? It's simply about whether he said it or not, and the communication happens through the intermediate superior. I don't know if I'm using words correctly right now, but I'm sure they make sense. I'm going to run with it. The difference here, especially you see it in like Gaudium et Spes' language about conscience, and we'll see it again when we see St. John Henry Newman, is that our authorities are not our only means to the moral truth, right? They help us, they guide us, they educate us. A child, for example, could learn a lot about the world through their own analysis of nature. But man, is that hard. Rather, you have people helping the child through this education. So when it comes to moral truth, especially since it has respect to our nature, and to reality, and to a truth that we can actually access with effort, with humility and sincerity, a person still, in some sense, should be able to know. Of course, it's complicated though, right? Like, what's the role of fear? And obviously, I don't want to get into a topic of like brainwashing. The example you use a lot for erring consciences, for example, is often like Nazis. Every moral, ethical question always has to end somehow in Nazis. And yeah, so like if you think strictly that if a person follows their conscience, it doesn't matter anything else. Like, can we argue for? Pope Benedict actually mentions this. So there's a person who was I think a theologian who actually like defended that case. So like, yeah, we have no reason to question the salvation of those people who did these horrific crimes because they were following their conscience. So there's no reason for us to think that they sinned. That should make you feel uncomfortable. That should make us all feel very uncomfortable. Is it really like that opaque for us to know what's right or wrong unless someone just tells us? And is it that opaque even for the person who's at top, like a Hitler? You think, no, I'm really convinced this is the right thing to do, even though no one's telling me that it is. Tiffany, you're always throwing all like the politically incorrect, edgy questions at me, or statements. But that is actually relatively true. This is, you might notice, I'm not an expert in Islamic thought and theology and ethics, but from what I know about it, it does seem very strictly authoritarian a lot of times. Very strictly with respect to command. There's a divine command theory of ethics, which is there in Christianity too in certain forms, in certain patches of Catholicism, but it's not at least a tradition insofar as it upholds like Thomas's thought and Henry Newman's thought, not actually what we understand to be morality or conscience. Thanks, Tiffany. Right, where was I? Oh yeah, so human beings can know morality. It does have, we do have a dependence on our community, on tradition, on our teachers, on the church, but that doesn't mean that we have no way of knowing it from ourselves. Like, there's still, in a sense, this voice of God within us. And I use my quotes here because I don't want to overemphasize that language at risk of making it sound pretty like strangely magical. There's some, in a sense, magical thing about conscience. We'll get to that when we get to St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Teresa's. But those are actually, really good questions. But definitely I wanted to get clear this notion of like erring conscience. What does one do with an erring conscience? And to show, in a sense, that it's not easy. There's not this clear way of being wrong about morality and still, in a sense, being fine. It's really important in our moral lives that we know what is moral, right? But follow your conscience. So that was all the one big asterisk to follow your conscience. All right. There's one other analogy I want to give quickly, at least with respect to the interaction between authority and conscience. This one I'm making up. So anyone can clearly like object to it and be like, Brother Andrew Thomas, that makes absolutely no sense. It was super unhelpful, and that's fine because analogies will always break down. But I think it makes sense, at least in showing some parts of the roles of authority, of law, of conscience, but also some other things like virtue. So I'm looking at, for example, first of all, this is a very teleological example. This is about arriving at an end, because I'm a Dominican and I like teleology and fancy words like teleology. Teleology just means a study of ends, study of purposes, in case you didn't know that. And I was just using that word over and over again. Conscience, in the case of us arriving at our destination, is something like a compass, right? It's this interior direction, and it applies in a way that law doesn't clearly to our particular case, right? The classic definition of conscience from St. Thomas Aquinas is it's an application of our knowledge on a particular action, right? So conscience has to do with particulars, whereas law is usually on the level of universal. And there is a connection between those two things. People sometimes divorce universal from particular. Oh yeah, you have a law, it's universal, but I'm in this particular situation. What can you tell me about that? Well, universals aren't just nothing, right? A particular is a particular of a universal. But this is getting into complex philosophical things we don't need to talk about. Anyway, conscience is the compass. Conscience is that which gives us a sense of direction in the particular situation. But the moral teaching of the church is something like a map, right? It tells us about the terrain, it tells us where we're trying to go. If you have the compass, but you don't have a map, you probably still don't really know where you're going, right? But if you have the map and you don't have the compass, you don't even really know how to apply it to where you are, right? If that makes some sense. Not perfect. And I'm not gonna throw GPS and things like that in here. Universal what, asks Tiffany. I'm talking about laws, basically. It's like universal morality, yet all things that are really moral are particulars insofar as their actions. Then again, you can't isolate every action. There's other things I can go into morality about that, but I'm not going to touch that right now. Of course, this I think also leaves room for, going back to the analogy, compass and map. Going back to the analogy, this also leaves some room for a notion of virtue, and especially the role of experience in the moral life. Virtues have to be practiced, right? Virtues are things that, habits, dispositions that get ingrained in us because of our practice of them, our exercise of these things. And that's kind of trivially like having a familiarity with the terrain, having walked this path before, right? Where, in a sense, questioning and examining conscience is not something that's so conscious, to use unfortunately similarly sounding words in one sentence, in that it's not that you're not questioning conscience, but you already know. You know where you're going. You know this is the terrain, and this way is north, and that this is where you need to go to get to your end. It's a familiarity with the moral life, and an exercise in doing it that makes it easy and enjoyable. So hence the important role of virtue within all of this too. And yet to be able to practice it, to be able to practice the right actions, and have familiar with the right terrain, to know the actual path, we still need that guidance that comes with the map, with the church. But it's not just about slavishly following law. The law is trying to teach us something about reality, right? It exists within reality itself. Again, so a person could technically just become familiar with the terrain and follow it. And it never contradicts the law. In a sense, it presupposes the law. Was that helpful? I don't know. But at least in a sense where, again, they're not opposing one another, they require one another. St. John Henry Newman, who we're going to talk about now, he even says that, in a sense, for the Pope to deny conscience and to deny the role of conscience is to kind of pull the ground under from his own feet. The papacy and the authority of the papacy in its moral teaching presupposes conscience, is what he says, which I think is really interesting and very insightful. So let's talk about St. John Henry Newman. The reading I assigned, I'm getting good for kind of questioning brows over one of those screens there. So I'm glad people are thinking. The text that I said for recommended reading is the letter to the Duke of Norfolk. It's a letter that Cardinal John Henry Newman wrote, St. John Henry Newman, sorry, in response to an Anglican priest or bishop, I don't remember, Duke, basically when he was objecting to papal infallibility as it was defined in the First Vatican Council. He says, the objector was basically saying, well, if you believe in papal infallibility, can we trust these people to live like a sincere political life if they've completely given up their consciences and their judgment, their intellects to this arbitrary person in Italy? Kind of classic anti-Catholic democratic argument. Think of the know-nothings in the US too. And so the letter to the Duke of Norfolk is St. John Henry Newman's response to that person, and chapter 5 on conscience has become sort of a classic text on understanding what is conscience in Christian life. And, I need a sip of coffee. I have it right here in this book, but you can get it for free on the link I sent. It's a pretty short read, and there's a lot of really good things in there. The most famous quote from here is the one that gets misquoted all the time. So I want to read it to you just so you know, like, don't misinterpret what he's saying here. It's at the very end of this letter, actually. Certainly, says St. John Henry Newman, if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink, to the Pope, if you please, still, to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. So, good old, sassy, very British John Henry Newman statement. The problem being that a lot of people find this, maybe post it somewhere on Pinterest, copy it, throw it everywhere else on the internet, and think, therefore, I need to follow my conscience, as opposed to the Pope. The Pope has something secondary to do with conscience. Again, that doesn't really work with the way we were talking about conscience and authority before. But he does talk about a primacy of conscience in a sense. And there's different ways to talk about that one. His thing when saying that the papacy and the moral authority of the papacy and of the church in general presupposing conscience basically is saying that the Pope assumes that the people he's teaching have this innate inclination and understanding that they have to do what is good. They have to do what is right. They have duties, right? And the Pope's job then is just to clarify what those duties are. There's no point in him giving moral teaching. There's no point in him trying to give this clarification if people don't care about being moral whatsoever. So conscience is this innate part of us that says, the weird accent that came out of me, says, do what is right, right? Do good, avoid evil. Obey God, but here is the way you need to understand what God is actually saying to you. That's the role of the teaching. That's the role of the actual moral thought. This ties in really closely to what St. Thomas Aquinas talks about with synderesis. And he actually quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, which makes me very happy, of course, in this section of the letter twice with some interesting things to say. So let's read some John Henry Newman. Let's see. Oh, no, before we get there, another classic quote that gets thrown around a lot. Conscience is not a long-sighted selfishness. So he's arguing against, here we're talking about the primacy of conscience, here's the importance of conscience, but let's make sure we understand what we mean when we say conscience, right? So this applies to some of the stuff we said before and the thing you referenced earlier, Tiffany. Conscience is not a long-sighted selfishness, nor is it a desire to be consistent with oneself. I think that's maybe a jab at Immanuel Kant. Instead, it is a messenger from him, capital H, who, both in nature and in grace, speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. And here, talking about the authority of the church. Conscience, and this is the classic part of the quote, conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessing and anathemas, and even though the eternal priesthood throughout the church would cease to be, in it the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. Very fancy things at the end. Don't worry about that so much. The famous quote definitely is that conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Conscience is vicar of Christ, therefore being a reference, in a sense, to the Pope. Having a similar kind of immediate intrinsic role within the domain of the soul. It has an authority to teach us, authority to guide us about what we ought to do. But in this very fundamental way. So conscience, the aboriginal vicar of Christ, again, kind of gets thrown around a lot, as a lot of people using John Henry Newman contrary to authority in the Pope. Not his point. You saw some of the stuff he said about conscience not being earlier. Let's read one more quote. Sorry, I got a lot of quotes. He's just got really good things. Conscience has rights because it has duties. Important one. Conscience has rights because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience, to ignore a lawgiver and judge, to be independent of unseen obligations. It becomes a license to take up this or that or let it go again. Conscience is a stern monitor, but in this century, he's talking about the 19th century, it has been superseded by a counterfeit, which 18 centuries prior to it never heard of and could not be mistaken for it if they had. It is the right of self-will. So he's clarifying, when he's talking about conscience, he is not talking about just the arbitrary freedom of the individual. Right? He's talking about an actual obligation found within the soul, a duty to do what is right that pulls us out of ourselves into an objective reality of the moral life. That's what he means by conscience. Okay. But I think it's from St. John Henry Newman probably that the church has sort of canonized this language of conscience being the law of God and the voice of God written within the hearts of the individual. This is scriptural, of course. You see this in St. Paul talking about the non-Christians, still the Gentiles, having the law written within their hearts. But But conscience is a super important role for John Henry Newman, and a lot of people will say that his entire life is in a sense, an examination or a treatise on conscience, insofar as he was, this influential, really famous thinker, leader, preacher in the Anglican Church. He, even right before his conversion, said, like, there's no one who has a less favorable view of the Roman Catholics than I do right now. And then he converted and became a Catholic. It was not because, like, he just had better friends there, not because he saw any, like, potential, like, benefit to his status, not because of any reason besides he knew it was the right thing to do, as much as it grated against him. As much as the Catholic Church was something he was fighting against his entire life, yet slowly approaching this attempt to really arrive at a Christianity that was continuous with the ancient church. John Henry Newman was a big fan of the church fathers, but that was actually what eventually led him to becoming Catholic. And it was a painful process for him. He left everything behind, all of his friends, all the souls to whom he was ministering. And a lot of the Catholics didn't seem to like him when he first joined too, because they didn't trust him because of how anti-Catholic he was initially. It was a brutal thing, but he did it simply because he was following his conscience. So this is an super important thing in him, and there's a lot of people who even claim that John Henry Newman should and hopefully will one day be named Doctor of Conscience for the Church. But we see most of the stuff that gets thrown around for the upholding of conscience, the dignity of conscience in the role of the person. But where does this dignity come from? What's its connection to reality? Let's see. I don't need to read that quote. Let's see how he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. He's going to start with talking about God. That's probably the right place to start. I say then that the Supreme Being is of a certain character, which, expressed in human language, we call ethical. God is good. He has the attributes of justice, of truth, wisdom, sanctity, benevolence, and mercy as eternal characteristics of his nature, the very law of his being identical with himself. Right? This is what God is in his nature. And next, when he became creator, he implanted this law, which is the goodness of his own nature, this law which is himself, in the intelligence of his rational creatures. The divine law, then, is the rule of ethical truth, the standard of right and wrong, a sovereign, irreversible, absolute authority in the presence of men and angels. Quoting St. Augustine, he says, the eternal law is the divine reason or will of God, commanding the observance, forbidding the disturbance of the natural order of things. The natural law, says St. Thomas, yay, St. Thomas Aquinas, is an impression of the divine light in us, a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. This law is apprehended in the minds of individual men, is called conscience. So this is where it all comes together. Yes, God has given us a natural law. This is the morality for human beings. And yet, this natural law is accessible to us, but it's something that we have to discover, right? We have to think about. It's not just this arbitrary thing within us, but it's something that requires our analysis of what we are and of what we're meant for. But it is written within us. So St. Thomas Aquinas will say, eternal law is essentially divine providence and God's wisdom, but especially with respect to the governance of creation. Human beings and angels, so rational spiritual creatures, have a very specific, unique relationship to the eternal law because they can participate in it through their own created providence, through our intellect and our will, right? Our choices. We can choose to act in furtherance of, in conformity with the eternal law, or we can act contrary to it, which plants, which animals, which rocks can't do. That rule in which we are participating in the eternal law is the natural law. It's our appreciation, the perception of the eternal law through reality and through our intellects. Okay, that was kind of complicated, but I'm trying to throw St. Thomas Aquinas into this talk about John Henry Newman. I was going to go with this. I'm trying to remember now. I'm going all over the place. Sorry. Let's just skip to St. Thomas Aquinas. Let's make it really quick. I won't spend too much time on this. Conscience for St. Thomas Aquinas then has two parts to it. There's a part that is really, really innate, that is actually infallible, which is that thing that St. John Henry Newman was talking about, that part of the soul that says, do what is good, do what is right. Right? He calls that synderesis. Do you have to know the fancy Greek word? No. But that's the word for it. Synderesis. It's a habit within the soul, the moral habit within the soul that says exactly those things. It gives us the first principles of the moral life. Do what is good. Right? Avoid what is evil. Or once we have, an appreciation of God's role within the moral life of the Christian, and of all creatures in general, obey God. Obey God's commands, which is doing what is good, etc. The other part of conscience, the secondary part of conscience, is the actual judgment. So conscience, for St. Thomas Aquinas, is not actually like this special power. Conscience is an act. Again, like I said, it's the application, right? It's a moral judgment, so it's an application of knowledge on the particular action. In a sense, conscience is a syllogism. It's very typical, like nerdy intellectualist St. Thomas Aquinas. Insofar as you have the first principle, which is applied by synderesis, which is that do what is good. You have that judgment, simply speaking, of like this particular action in this particular situation is what is good for me, and therefore I should do this. To him, that's really what conscience is. It's that mix of that part that's infallible within the soul, deeply innate, and that part that actually involves our judgment. An intellectual act on our part to say, this is what it applies to. So conscience then can be a judge for our previous actions, for the ones we're about to do, and for ones in the future, simply by comparing it to what we think applies to morality. It's really that simple. Where the heck is God in the voice of Christ and Jiminy Cricket or whatever in this image? In a sense, it's simply between the powers of that moral habit, the fact that we have this inclination within us that says, do what is good. It is your responsibility to do that which you are supposed to do. It's not just pure animal instinct anymore. It's something that's within your will. But you have that inclination towards that. And you have the power to actually know what it is, to participate in God's wisdom, in figuring out what is moral within us. That role, that connection between the natural law and the eternal law, that's in a sense how the voice of God speaks within us truly, and yet we can err because there's a human element to it. Because the divine, the eternal law is still received within the human being, within a human mode, right? And so it can be distorted in that. It doesn't change the fact that it has that authority. We have to do that which is right, according to that moral habit placed within us. Was that technical? Yep. Sorry, guys. But I do think it's important because it kind of demystifies some of what conscience is, and yet theologizes it, shows where God comes within that. So quick last thoughts before you guys can just ask whatever questions you want. We'll just hang out. What is then the deformation of conscience? Just to review everything we're talking about. It's definitely in the elimination of the role of truth in our moral reflection, right? Or so, in this case, a reduction of morality to something that resides entirely in the emotions or in the will. And oftentimes I think it's just, especially when it resides within the will, it's simply a discomfort with the possibility of us being wrong. And choosing, in a sense, to be more uncomfortable with that, I might be wrong, with the discomfort that I think a lot of us might have with the fact that everyone seems to disagree on what's the right or wrong thing to do. That makes me plenty uncomfortable. And sometimes that demands on my part for me to analyze what I think is right or wrong. So with that, then, the deformation of conscience involves a refusal to be instructed, possibly, or on the intellectual side, or just a lack of reflection, a lack of us really thinking about what is or wrong, right or wrong generally, and in this particular situation. It can involve a domination of the passions, our attachment to things where, in a sense, our desire for created things, our emotions, kind of just short circuit the reflection process. We don't even want to bother thinking about what's right or kind of presenting to our will this rational reflection on morality. It's just do what it feels like and don't think, don't bother thinking. Not good. In a sense, it's ignoring one's conscience, obviously. But also, to talk about external things, there's the role of bad examples. And here we can talk about like instructors. Here's the importance of the role of the family, for example, for forming the consciousness of the children. And of course, also of the clergy, of priests who have that role of being shepherds and teaching. But the other thing I also want to mention then is the confusion of morality and legality, of thinking that that which is legal is that which is right. And this is obviously an easy mistake to make, especially for children, because you don't know what's right, so instead you get presented rules. This is what you're supposed to do. Eventually you'll understand it, but right now you just need to follow what your parents are saying, right? So if any of the Borges kids are still around, listen to your mom. But eventually reflect on what she's saying and eventually discover why she's telling you to do those things. What is actually true and good in itself. That's the mature way of reflecting on morality, but we start with that more legalistic obedience. The problem is if people stick to that and reduce morality then simply to commands. Commands are good. Commands are there to help us and to instruct us, especially when we don't have the tools to do the analysis and the reflection ourselves. But the danger here is something, especially like a scrupulosity, a form of morality that doesn't reflect the freedom of the individual, that doesn't reflect the freedom of the Christian life, because the yoke of Christ is supposed to be something that's light, right? Of course, it has serious demands on it, but it comes with, more than anything else, the gift of love that makes those things possible, the gift of divine charity. Sorry, I'm going to go quickly to the comments. Oh, I missed the hippies comment. I wonder when that was actually supposed to be thrown around. All right, what does Jerry say? Jerry says, so much for humans depends on avoiding suffering, which in itself is good, right? But it leads to a lot of what is not good. Very true. Pope Benedict cites a few psychologists and philosophers who say that conscience is something like the faculty of experiencing pain, right? In that it seems in many ways unpleasant, but there's something clearly wrong in the human being if it's not there. If you can't feel pain, then you can't know what is right or wrong for you. And similar with one who ignores conscience. However, since that analogy also breaks apart when those two things interact, conscience and suffering, it's true that the avoiding of pain, which is a natural reaction, is still not a rational reaction. So us avoiding suffering, which in itself is good, is still something subordinate to us doing what is good for the rational spiritual creature. To pursue what is good, to do the will of God, to love God and neighbor, really ultimately as summed up by Christ himself. But at least on the natural level, it's simply to act rationally more than it is to act in a human way. For instance, euthanasia. Oh, okay, that's a can of worms. What are we talking about? Did I misinterpret your question initially? Let me see this again. So much for humans depends on avoiding suffering. Leads to a lot of what is not good. For instance, euthanasia. Isn't avoidance of suffering, though, cited as a distinction equals... I don't think I understand what you're saying, Tiffany. I'm sorry. Nice clarification. Bravo you for being able to type while also caring and tending to your child. Clear maternal virtue there. Cited as a distinction. I'm still a little confused. It'd be nice if you can unmute yourself if it's not too loud over there.
Okay, most children are outside, so I can do that.
Okay.
I think I might be mixing Jordan Peterson with Thomas Aquinas.
They are slightly different.
I've heard this like like cited with a higher up authority than just someone on YouTube. But I feel like it's a big brain thinker who said like the definition of effeminacy, not being feminine, but like that it's a trap that men and women can both fall into, is that we avoid hardship or suffering, and that's effeminacy and weakness. Does this ring a bell to anyone else?
I haven't followed Jordan Peterson very closely. If he's the one who said that, I wouldn't be surprised.
I endure him. I did not. Yeah, only because he gets played in my So, because I know to me he gets into like shaky territory, but he's so commanding that I don't want to listen to him. I don't know. He appeals to some guy, but this doesn't sound from like. I really think it's Thomas Aquinas, but you would know if it was.
I mean, he probably does talk about that.
What's that?
I usually, just because there's so much clarification in this movie, don't use the word effeminacy in that context, but I mean, it makes sense. There's a tradition for it.
Because it gets muddled and it makes it sound like you're dogging on femininity.
Right,
you mean?
which is a different thing. There is real feminine virtue and strength. And there's a lot of women who have a stronger pain tolerance than men.
Right.
But, getting more straight to the point. I mean, honestly, it's something in a way more animalistic than it is human. In that hardship is, like, of course, you're not trying to pursue suffering, but even animals have the power to be able to. It's something called the irascible appetite. It's the tendency for us to pursue something that's good but difficult, right? So let's just go into domestic psychology. Why not? Everyone who's here is here for the long haul. Anyone else might have left already. I know, Grace, your mom's probably going to force you to stay no matter how long I talk. So St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the passions and the sensible appetite in two ways. Anyone who was at, I think, Father Thomas Aquinas' talk earlier in the year, he talked about this too. He probably did a much better job than I'm going to right now. There's one thing called the concupiscible appetite and the irascible appetite. The concupiscible appetite is, in a sense, a simpler emotion. It's simply pursuing that which is good, simply avoiding that which is evil, in the sensible sense. That was really redundant. So love, hatred, aversion, desire, these are things that belong to the concupiscible appetite. This is good, and I want it, and I have it, and now I'm happy. Good. The irascible appetite is more complex. It depends on the concupiscible appetite to tell us this is good and this is bad. But the irascible appetite says, here is a good, but I can only go through something that's already bad to get to it. Right? It's a difficult good to acquire. And so it requires that strength, in a sense, that fortitude, to be able to endure that evil for the sake of the good. The irascible appetite also involves things like fear. So far, I see a good, but this evil is too great, and I fear it. So it's a complex emotion that ties into those things. So within the animal and within the human person, there's this whole array of passions happening in hardship. Right? Insofar as by hardship, we mean not just simply suffering or simply good. Right? A lot of times when we're talking about like not being effeminate, not being able to endure hardship, we're talking about something that involves that complexity between the good and the bad. There's nothing like heroic or manly about enduring arbitrary suffering for no reason. That's just dumb. One doesn't need to do that. So this is, in a sense, where the role of reason and will commanding the passions and organizing them, to take input from them, because they're really parts of us, and they're really part of how we perceive the world, but being able to make the judgment of, yes, this is something that is difficult, and yet it is worth pursuing. So we have the aversion, the concupiscible appetite, working contrary to that hope or the daring of the irascible appetite. And in a sense, reason and will can act as a judge between the two, if it's strong enough. So I'm interpreting this weakness then to simply being the reason the will not having command over one's emotions. Whatever happens between those different appetites simply just kind of like mows the person over. There's not a reflection, there's not a choice. It's just reaction. Right? Does that make some sense? Cool. Interesting that we got to that topic. I wasn't really sure where that came from, but it is a really important thing to talk about. Was there anything else I wanted to say? Formation of conscience, because we were talking about deformation of conscience. Right, because we were talking about the passions and how that can deteriorate the role of conscience within the person. True, very good. So some things that the Catechism actually says in terms of this. It says, ignorance of Christ and his gospel, bad example given by others, enslavement to one's passions, so I'm not just getting this out of nowhere. Assertion of a mistaken notion of autonomy of conscience, rejection of the church's authority in her teaching, lack of conversion and of charity. These are the sources of errors in judgment and moral conduct. Cool. Catechism says it too. So therefore, what are we supposed to do about making sure we have a formed conscience? On our own part, reflection on moral principles, reflection on morality, being willing to think about it, to wrestle with these questions. But also in a less speculative way, practical experience, right? Memory. This is how we learn a lot about what's good and what's bad. This is how we learn about what works and what doesn't, because we're talking about needs and actions, right? It requires memory. And this is actually why, I think, again, just to say, Thomas Kang again, I remember him giving a talk on prudence, and he says actually this is why the role of the examination of conscience is so important in the life of the Christian. To allow conscience, give it the time to make judgments about what we have done, right? And in reflecting on that, to allow that to really take its place in our memory so we can form our future actions, right? It's one thing to have done something and to have some kind of general inclination that was probably not a good thing to do, but to just kind of let it pass. Another thing to sit down at the end of the day, look back on it and be like, yeah, that was wrong. That was selfish. That was dumb. That was overly emotional or something, blah, blah, blah. Or not considerate. That was not a good thing. I know where that mistake's coming from, and I ought to avoid it. And allowing that reflection, that memory, and that resolution linger in one's head, in a sense, helps towards the development towards a stronger conscience, since it has more material to work with to make its judgment, and a stronger sense of prudence, because it has a stronger resolution to do what is good in the particular situation. So, the examination of conscience is important in becoming a moral person, guys. I highly recommend it. It's a good thing to do at night. Oftentimes, for religious, it's something kind of thrown into Compline. There's a part of Compline that says, like, this is a good time to do an examination of conscience. Unfortunately, most of us do like a really, really quick one. But you can always do it again at night before bed. Besides that, counsel of others. So taking advice from people you trust. Obviously, for people who are young, that'll be our parents. Assuming parents are really taking their role seriously as educators for the children. But also just those who you trust to have experience, have wisdom, have real reflective nature. And hopefully that will include your clergy, include the priests who are giving homilies and giving confessions, and giving spiritual directors. And in the very exceptional, really desperate case, for some reason, the council of a residency brother is assigned to Alaska at that time. But generally, I'll go to the priest first. Reflection on the moral teachings of the church also. So again, try and get past legalism into morality. The church teaches something, yes, but why? Is a really important question. Because she's teaching us. She's not just commanding us. And the teacher doesn't want the student to just be like, cool, I've memorized what you said and I can answer your question correctly. The goal of the teacher is that the person understand through principles and through the reasoning to be able to come to the same conclusion, yeah, but the entire way to it, to be able to work from that conclusion also. I don't want to talk too much about laxity and rigorism. There was a whole controversy over this, I think, in the 18th century in moral theology. Basically, laxity is thinking like, well, I don't know. It's questions of certainty of conscience. How sure are you what is the right thing to do? Laxity is like, well, if I'm not sure absolutely that this is the right thing to do, I can always choose like the most lax, the easiest, loosest option that I see as maybe somewhere within the realm of permissibility. Rigorism is kind of on the opposite case, like absolute certainty, and if not absolute certainty, choose what is hardest, what is most demanding. The church basically denied both of those and said, no, that neither of those is possible. You have to have a desire to do what's virtuous. So laxity doesn't work. Right? It's not about getting by with the minimum. Try to be a good person. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. But that doesn't mean that morality equals suffering. That morality equals having difficulty in doing this good act. Virtue actually is supposed to make morality something easier. Of course, we can't be absolutely searching in our conscience about everything. And you have to make actions. So yes, trust your conscience. Do what seems most probable. And then be open to correction afterwards. It's kind of like the short thing of that. And then again, we talked about this last week in the more theological, speculative side. But on the practical level, I just want to bring up scrupulosity one more time. Because I know it's a thing that there are people out there who struggle with. With scrupulosity, at this point, you can't trust your conscience. Right? In a sense, you have a deformed conscience that's, in a sense, being oppressive to the individual. It's an obsessive-compulsive conscience. There's a lot of connections between scrupulosity and obsessive-compulsive disorder a lot of times. So from most of the things that I've read and a lot of people I've talked to, at this point, to be able to form a conscience, you can't do it by yourself. For the scrupulous person, you need help. Just like a person who actually has something like an obsessive-compulsive disorder would need professional help. So what I've seen recommended a lot, and something I want to pass on, is, in this case, find a spiritual director or a regular confessor. Find someone you can trust, but who is willing to be hard on you. And in a sense, ask them to take the role of your prudence, the role of your conscience. Because yours might, in the case of the scrupulous person, it's not working. It's making morality and life in general just like way too burdensome. So instead, what's needed is to just give oneself entirely to obedience to one's confessor and say, if he tells me that this thing is not a sin, I have to trust him. It's in a sense like a strict trust in someone else who's going to be less strict than you. Right? From what I've seen, it seems to be like really one of the only solutions, at least initially speaking, to a person who's really suffering from scrupulosity. Basically, place yourself in the hands of God through the other person. Of course, you have to be careful to choose, but you do need to choose someone, because it's not something that a scrupulous person can do by themselves. It's just like the need of a person with a mental illness to be able to admit that they need help, to go get professional help. There's no shame in that. You just need to be real about the illness that's present and take realistic steps towards treatment. All right, that was kind of a weird ending. It's a little unorganized, sorry guys. But that's really all I have. So I went on kind of long, but do you guys have any questions? I'll take them both sides and try and observe the Facebook Live side too. In light of conscience, what does it mean to behave like the sheep Jesus wants us to be? Very good question. Sheep is, the imagery of sheep is both very beautiful and often mocked. So like you see this, especially with like the new atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, God rest his soul, if he's willing to let God rest it. Talking about like how like degrading is the image of the sheep, of this blind obedience. So I would say sheep applies in multiple ways. One being, yes, an openness to counsel and an obedience to the shepherd, but not just that simply. I think a lot of it in the imagery of the sheep is less about the sheep and more about the shepherd, right? The imagery of sheep only really applies in the relationship of sheep and shepherd. He's not just arbitrarily saying sheep, but he's saying, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. So in that case, more than anything, I think it's about trust in Christ, trust in God, right? That he is the one who provides, who protects, who guides, and who will lead us to where we ought to go. Does that make sense? So not simply like this unintelligent animal that's just arbitrarily doing dumb things and fighting its friends off a cliff. That's not the image of sheep that we're trying to go for. It's imagery. It's not perfect, right? There's a dignity in the human person as an intellectual creature, and yet you can still compare him in relationship to God as sheep, because God is something so much higher still. So not sheep just to other men as shepherds, but 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 sheep with respect to God, who is a shepherd. God uses that imagery even, well, obviously, like Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, right? Although the Latin for some reason says Dominus regit me, God ruleth over me. So that distance in intelligence, in wisdom between the shepherd and the sheep is still only something analogous to the distance, in a sense, between our understanding of our reality and of moral reality and what we ought to do, our ability to provide for ourselves, and that of God, divine wisdom and divine providence. That's my take. Now do the fox and the dove. Thank you, Tiffany. Clarification on that one, please.
Is it what's the is it a serpent?
Yes, it's a serpent. I thought you were talking about that, but I wasn't sure.
It's Minnesota in me. I'm sorry. I like that it's not. We are just subjugating to something so omniscient we can't even really mimic it. But it's not insulting. It's that God is so
right,
abundant and loving, and I like that.
Yeah, so it's not about degrading us, but more about understanding how much higher God is. Yeah.
That's a great question.
Right. And I think the entire serpent, or fox, I suppose, if you want fox, and dove imagery, I think also works to show, like, you can't just, these images, these analogies aren't perfect in themselves, right? We're human beings, we're spiritual creatures. That's the important part. But he's using them still to teach us about something specific, and you can always misinterpret the imagery that our Lord's using, misinterpret the parables, as people did even in this time. So I think the distinction there being as cunning as a serpent, but as pure, as innocent as a dove, points to that, right? Like, these images aren't perfect, but you need all of these things. Sheep do not listen to the shepherd whose voice it does not recognize, right? So I think that part, especially with respect to conscience and the role of God and specifically of Christ, in guiding the individual soul, has to do with that. Familiarity with the voice of Christ being essential to the moral life. So imitating and following him, and doing that which he's asking of us, which of course then requires faith, which requires a life of prayer, which requires familiarity with what he actually said and actually taught. So a study of his teaching, of his life, of the doctrines of the church. And in this case, for us also, because the role of shepherd is something that Christ has allowed people to participate in different levels. So not every person who is really a leader, every person, parents, for example, in a sense, having a shepherding role for their children, but obviously the case being most explicit in the role of bishops as shepherds for the flock. That's a real thing, and so we have to trust in the authority given to them also, and in that way trust in the good shepherd who's working behind their own shepherding, just like we can trust in the priesthood behind the not so satisfactory priest who's really been given the power to celebrate the sacraments, to forgive sins, if that makes sense. A lot of different directions to take this, which is what makes it such a rich and beautiful image. It doesn't apply simply in one direction or the other. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just the one who resolves everything into hope and trust, because this seems to be a topic I mention a lot. But I do think a lot of the entirety of salvation history is kind of hinges on that theme. Any other questions? Facebook Live community has trickled down a little bit. I think I went way too long. I'm sorry, guys. But I am open to questions from you guys too. Nice. I'm glad they're working together. Tiffany was talking about how the complement between different classes. So yeah, at least insofar as this class is talking about like what our role is, what we're doing, even though we talked about providence and predestination last week. You can never eliminate the role of the human person. You can never eliminate the role of God. in the life of the Christian. Okay, if there's no other questions, that's it. Next week I will do. There's one question. Well, I'm gonna finish my thought first. Next week I'm gonna give another talk at 11 o'clock like usual, but this time it'll be. I think I want to do it on the Mass. I feel like that'd be like a good topic where, kind of bittersweet elephant in the room in some ways on what the situation right now, but also not too soon, not too close to home when it first came, because I was definitely thinking about doing it initially, but I was like, maybe not quite yet. Let's just let people settle in first. Okay, so that'll be the topic. It'll be on the sacrifice of the Mass. The Mass as sacrifice is the part I want to emphasize. Okay, Grace, lowering your hand and unmuting you. I think I unmuted you. Maybe not. It's not working. Oh, there you are. Were we clicking at the same time? Is that what happened?
Well, it gives us a prompt where we allow you to unmute us.
Oh, okay. Good. I'm glad you consented.
This is taking I guess a different direction, but what is the difference then between the second part of conscience, where it's the not as in the eternal law objective, but the more subjective part of the conscience? What's the difference between that and personality first? Personality, because when you think of personality, you always hear about how people always do actions and according to gaining a good, but no one does something thinking that they're not getting a good out of it. And so every action that the person does is for a good, which sounds very similar to what we're saying with conscience, that it's a good, and then the second part of conscience is going this is how I'll obtain the good, and this is how I'm going to go about it. So is there a difference between then the second part of conscience and personality?
I think I would need a stronger notion of what you mean by personality, because that word gets used in a couple different ways.
I guess what I mean is you mean for example is if we're describing personality as a person's strengths towards different virtues. Different vices, or inclinations towards certain
I get virtues and vices mixed up all the time, which is usually the cause of my going to confession. But when a person is, because as we're all going about in life, and we're all always doing our actions towards something that we perceive as good, then different people, what we will say is our personality, are stronger. They're more they have more fortitude. They would be more, or some people might say foolhardy. They'll go towards it. They'll have a stronger, what we call a stronger personality. They're quicker to act, rather than people who won't act as quickly. Maybe it's because of humility. Maybe it's because of cowardice. But it's from a perception of what you think is going to be good for yourself. The person who has a stronger personality and who will go forth and do things quicker are going to be, and again, not even to a vice, just people who have more fortitude might know when it's time to act, and they act quicker than somebody who might be not in a bad way, but more prudent, and just is kind of waiting it out to see what's the best situation that they can act upon. Neither one is bad, and and we see in all of the saints don't have the same personality. There's some that were more had better, you think of them as very prudent saints, or some saints were a lot more courageous. Saint Francis, he went off into the desert, according to, you know what I mean? And then there's other saints like Saint John Vianney, who seem a lot more reserved in a way, almost. Or there's saints that are more reserved, and there's other ones that really wanted to be a martyr, so they went off somewhere, trying to become a martyr. They were both saints, but just one you recognize as more stronger in fortitude, one is stronger in humility. And so that's kind of what I mean by
personality?
Yeah, I think, and to give like a proper answer to this, is unfortunately probably have to be super nuanced. But the short answer, I think, is that I would say conscience in a way precedes a lot of that. Insofar as conscience is not the same thing as like prudence, for example. Conscience is not a virtue, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. It doesn't yet resolve itself into the actual act. It simply judges acts and possible actions on us. So our personality, I think, is a lot of what happens after conscience. The prudent person, yes, has maybe an eagerness to do that which conscience says. So disposition to follow one's conscience might be part of prudence. Although I'll get to the nuance a little bit. Let's start here. But for example, the fact that we can have conscience telling us what to do, and then having our personality make it easier or harder to do that thing that conscience is demanding of us, in a sense, lets conscience live kind of above the level of the personality. To a certain degree. I don't want to make that absolute. Why? Because the judgment that we make still depends on a lot of things. There's, for example, St. Thomas also talks about like intellectual virtues. And also the role of, I guess, like our memory, our familiarity with moral terrain, our ability to make moral reflection, contributing to that act of conscience, that judgment in terms of this is the right thing or this is the wrong thing. So yes, but I think most of it happens afterwards. The role of the passions, the role of the virtues, I think generally follows. It's consequent upon the judgment of conscience. We have that first principle, we have the judgment of the action, the conclusion, this is the right thing we should do. But then before that becomes the thing we do actually, there's the emotions and the will and the virtues that affect all those things that move us towards doing it well, doing it quickly, doing it promptly, or resisting it, if that makes sense.
I might not be getting it, but then what's the, because virtues are habitual.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that kind of go more towards like not after conscience? Does that, I don't know if that makes any sense, but like if a person is practicing prudence a lot, and so they're not the type to like go forth quickly and do things. They practice the virtue of prudence, and so it becomes habitual. Then when a situation shows up, then wouldn't the person like almost as
that's a really good point. And honestly, that opens up a pretty tough question that I barely grazed in my research on this, which is really what's the distinction between prudence and conscience? Because a lot of times it seems like they do a very similar thing, right? Insofar as like prudence is a queen, the mother of all the other virtues, as the Greeks would say. And it's really about like being able to judge and do that which is the right thing to do in that particular situation. It's prudence. The answer I heard, which is like really short, like little video I watched some Dominican in Freiburg answering the question, what is the difference? Was still rather opaque to me. He talked about how conscience judges the moral act, or like judges that it is true that this thing is the right thing to do, whereas prudence actually presents it to us as good. Why that difference? The idea is prudence as an actual virtue, as a moral virtue, and the prudent person does that which is right. Right? It's not just about judging, not just about knowing what's right, but does that which is right. That's something that's key to being prudent. The prudent person is virtuous. The prudent person has the other virtues on which they act. The person who has right judgment and conscience doesn't have to do those things, though, right? A person, in a sense, can have a strong conscience and yet not follow it.
right.
That doesn't apply to prudence. This gets really confusing.
Because like,
Keep going.
I guess then, if it wasn't prudence, if it was a different virtue, even then,
It's not a virtue. That's the thing.
or well, because like I guess if like you kept practicing like the if you kept practicing the virtue fortitude, it would also become habitual. So then, I guess because I understand then the trying to distinguish like the prudence from conscience, but then like by the same token, like what if it was fortitude, that like the person is practicing habitually fortitude, so they have a very strong sense of fortitude, and so would that again though be affecting like the conscience? Like,
I do think there is some way that, I don't know if retroactively is the right way to say it, but like that those things like the virtues do affect the way our conscience works. So that was the nuanced part I was talking about. I do think in the sense it requires virtues to be able to make right moral judgments. But in the analysis of the actual moral action, the individual action, I think they follow it.
Okay.
And it gets complicated because all these things are very connected. So like, you can't be courageous. You can't have fortitude. Be fortitudinous, if I want to use actually an actual word, without prudence, right? There's no such thing as fortitude without judging what is the right, courageous thing to do. If you're being brave about something wrong or dumb, that's just being dumb and daring, but it's not truly virtuous.
Yeah.
So they are connected, and they all do depend on each other. I think both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas talk about how you can't have prudence without the other virtues, and you can't have the other virtues without prudence, which just makes things more complicated. Human beings are very, very fancy, beautiful, mind-boggling things. But I do think there's maybe some wisdom in not trying to oversimplify the system of the moral action and the role of the virtues. Yeah, again, conscience has a pretty particular role, and I wish the research I had done made it a lot clearer to me where it fits within all that. But for St. Thomas, conscience is really, in a sense, practical reasoning.
You can kill your conscience, right, brother? By like constantly doing the bad, like you said, you can know what's good and what's evil, and prudence would choose for the good. But you can also say, like you said, conscience doesn't actually make the decision, right? So is that the way you kill your conscience? I mean, you basically always choose what you want, but you know that it's not right. And then sooner or later, doesn't it become in your conscience right? Because you can make a lot of excuses too.
Right.
Well, I did this.
I do think that's also a part where all that nuance and that feedback starts coming in, where initially probably it's about acting contrary to one's conscience, right?
Right.
But eventually I think it becomes a deformation of that conscience. So not just that one's resisting what they know to be true, but even lying to oneself about what is good eventually. And that affects our moral judgment. Do I have a full analysis of the act from vices back to the intellectual virtues that make the moral judgment? No, not right now. Sorry, I have nothing for you.
And how easy would that be? I mean, that must be very difficult once you keep doing that, other than like a singular grace. Because if you keep training yourself to act against your conscience until you almost start to believe that what's wrong is right, then how do you even come back from something like that? Because it's inside of you at this point.
With both virtues and vices, because they're habits, both take effort to acquire. Both, in a sense, take effort to lose. So the good side of that is if you are strong in a virtue, it's not easy to lose that virtue. You can weaken it, yes, and over repeated acts and over time, you can lose it. But it's supposed to be something stable. Downside of that is that vices are stable. And it becomes a lot of work to consistently act contrary to that vice to eliminate it. And it requires us acting virtuously for us to acquire prudence, and somehow magically there's some connection between prudence and conscience.
Wow.
Which I think will, hopefully get us back to that starting point. But yeah, I do think Acting viciously does affect our moral judgment, obviously. What was that?
That's why God lets us live a long time.
Yeah, probably to a certain degree.
I mean, so, you know, because it takes a long time.
Right.
You
And
know?
obviously there is grace, and grace does have a role, but does it work like always extraordinarily, always kind of spontaneously? Not really. I don't have reason to think that. I think God does want us to apply effort for acquisition of virtue, and development of virtue. But it can happen, and it has happened in the lives of many saints.
That's true. That's true. St. Paul, that's true.
St. Paul, dramatic conversion for sure. St. Thomas Aquinas, the thing was after one temptation by his brothers, and him conquering that temptation, they basically threw a prostitute into his room when he was under house arrest. And they weren't letting him become a Dominican, and so he chased her out with like a burning stick, and then drew a cross with the ashes on his door, and then prayed. And the story goes that, hey, there you go, yeah, angelic warfare confraternity, that's great. And then 2 angels came, girded him with a cord of purity, and then ever since then he had 0 temptations of chastity. Which sounds crazy, but that's what they said. All right. Well, if that's that. Not to condemn those whose temperament seems either too reserved or too brash. The conscience may be equally formed and thriving. The conscience is a muscle. Again, I'm not entirely sure I'm following that, but that's probably because I'm reading out of context.
Sorry. No, I was just echoing sort of as Grace was asking.
Oh, okay.
Like I was working my own mind.
Nice, good.
Like, would you observe something and think that's not virtuous or well-formed? It's difficult to know. Right? I mean, because it's someone else's heart. But yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, it's very...
It's okay. And yeah, I mean, that obviously opens up, like, morality is not just about us talking about conscience. That immediately throws us into the entire realm of what are the virtues in the world of virtues, because realistically, we need to talk about our habits and our dispositions, and our passions when it comes to actually doing moral things. When the analysis of conscience is primarily about our judgments about what is moral. So that's kind of the main distinction I want to make, as unclear as it might be. If that helps. Okay, I think I'm going to call it, because it's already almost getting to 1. It's kind of long.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for hanging out. Good to see you, Grace. Good to see you guys who, oh my gosh, hung out on Facebook Live. Thank you for hanging on there. Thank you for joining. Hope that was something useful, and I wasn't rambling too much, although clearly I was. See you guys.
Bye, brother. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.